date was eventually set. Let's take a step back and learn about Varka's backstory. Of Warsaw brutally killed Varka Rani just a few months into their marriage. The news sent shockwaves through both Josvir's and Varka's families. Josvir's family struggled to come to terms with their son's sexuality, while Varka's family was consumed by grief. The evidence against Josvir was overwhelming, and he was subsequently taken into custody and brought to trial at Wolverhampton Crown Court. Although Josvir initially attempted to denial and deceive to avoid punishment, he was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment after a grueling 3-month trial. Furthermore, he would be ineligible for parole for at least 20 years. Welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of April Tinsley. April Tinsley was born on March 18, 1980, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, as the eldest child in her family. She attended elementary school and was involved in the local church's children's choir, but her true passion was socializing with friends, exploring the neighborhood, and simply enjoying herself. On Friday, April 1, 1988, 8-year-old April returned home from school early, eager to start her afternoon adventures. After lunch, she asked her mom if she could visit her friend Nicole, who lived just a few hundred yards away. Her mom consented, as she had many times before. Nicole's house was a short, familiar walk away, and their neighborhood was considered a safe haven. As April set off, her mom reminded her to call as soon as she arrived at the Coles house and handed her an umbrella, anticipating the impending rain. A few minutes later, April called her mom from the Coles house, and her mom instructed her to be back home by 4 p.m. However, when the appointed time came and went, April still hadn't returned. Her mom began to worry that she might get caught in the rain and called Nicole's house. Nicole's mom answered, saying that April and her daughter had gone to play at a nearby playground. While they were there, it started to rain, and April realized she had left her umbrella at Nicole's house. April told Nicole she would walk to her house, retrieve the umbrella, and then head home, as she had promised her mom. Nicole, on the other hand, decided to visit another friend's house, and the girls went their separate ways. However, when Nicole's mom informed April's mom that April never stopped by to get the umbrella, despite leaving the playground almost an hour ago, April's mom immediately grew concerned. She alerted her husband that their daughter was missing, and they set out to search for her. Several neighbors joined in upon hearing about April's disappearance, and together they combed all the streets connecting Nicole's house, the playground, and their home. But they found no sign of her. The parents then decided to contact the police. Officers arrived at the Tinleys' home, obtaining a photo and description of April, and promptly launched a search effort. Within hours, dozens of neighbors joined the search party, eager to help the family locate their daughter. The search area spanned several miles around April's usual route, but despite their efforts, no signs of her were found. As night descended, the police began to suspect that they were likely dealing with a kidnapping, reasoning that if April had simply gotten lost, she would have been located by now. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. The next day, the search area was broadened, and news of April's disappearance swept through the city. Despite an influx of police and volunteers joining the effort, they still couldn't find her or any leads. This continued for 3 days until April 4th, when a jogger phoned 911, reporting a disturbing discovery. While running along a road about 20 meters from April's home, he had noticed something peculiar in a ditch. As he drew closer, he realized it was a human body. The police rushed to the scene and confirmed the worst. It was April Tinsley. She was fully clothed, except for one shoe. Officers couldn't find any obvious signs of trauma on her body, but they were almost certain she had been murdered. They theorized that an unknown perpetrator had killed her elsewhere, then brought her to this field and left her body in a ditch. Police also discovered an adult toy nearby, although they weren't sure if it was linked to the case. Later, they found April's second shoe lying on the other side of the road, a few hundred yards from her body. Medical experts determined that April's death was caused by asphyxiation, and she had also been sexually assaulted. They established that her death had occurred within the 48 hours preceding the discovery of her body, indicating that the perpetrator had held her captive for some time. Although forensic science and DNA analysis were still in their infancy, experts managed to collect evidence from the body. However, the lack of a DNA database at the time meant detectives had to rely on new leads. Fortunately, they didn't have to wait long after the body was found. Investigators appealed to the public through the media, and numerous tips were received. Two tips, in particular, caught their attention. One individual contacted the police, reporting that he had driven past the field where April's body was found and noticed an old blue pickup truck parked on the side of the road. Investigators believed it could belong to the killer, and the witness might have seen it when the perpetrator dumped April's body in the ditch, making this lead even more valuable. A woman living along the route from the playground to Nicole's house reported seeing a girl resembling April on the day of her disappearance. According to the witness, as the girl walked along the road, an old blue pickup truck pulled up beside her, and, a few seconds later, it drove away with the girl on board. Although the car obstructed her view, the witness couldn't see exactly how the girl got inside. This tip became the first significant lead for investigators, who were also provided with a description of the driver: a white man around 30 years old with blonde or ginger hair. Based on this information, police created a sketch of the suspect and distributed it to the media, along with a description of his vehicle, hoping someone would recognize him. The FBI soon joined the investigation, and together with the police, they looked into the possible involvement of all men who had previously been convicted of sexual crimes living in April's area, seeking new leads. At some point, they were informed that the suspect's portrait resembled a man who had been involved in organized crime activities and had an interest in Satanism. Investigators checked on this individual, but couldn't establish his involvement. However, they arrested him for another offense unrelated to April's disappearance. Police continued to pursue leads and investigate numerous individuals, but they failed to make any significant breakthroughs. This stagnant state persisted for several months, and eventually, detectives hit a dead end. Notably, during the course of the investigation, police uncovered several other crimes against children and apprehended the perpetrators, but the individual responsible for April's murder remained at large. In the following years, the case saw no major advancements, but in May 1990, a sudden and unexpected twist emerged. A teenage boy living 10 miles from where April's body was discovered found a message on his shed written from the perspective of the perpetrator. The killer confessed to April's murder, hinting at further crimes to come, and inquired about the status of the victim's second shoe. This prompted detectives to suspect that the author was likely April's killer rather than a prankster. The discovery was significant because the detail about the victim's shoe being found several hundred yards from her body had never been released to the media, making it unlikely that anyone but the killer would know this. Another fascinating aspect of the message was that it had initially been written in pencil and then traced over in marker. This led investigators to theorize that the perpetrator may have left the message months prior to its discovery and then returned to make it more conspicuous by outlining it in marker. Police decided to release photos of the cryptic message, hoping someone would recognize the handwriting, but unfortunately, it didn't yield any breakthroughs. Just a few months later, the residents of Wayne were left reeling by the shocking news that police had discovered the body of a 7-year-old girl in another part of the city. She had been sexually assaulted, and the cause of death was asphyxiation. Given the eerie parallels to April's case, police instinctively suspected that the same perpetrator was behind this heinous crime. However, FBI profilers disagreed, convinced that they were dealing with two separate offenders. Despite their efforts, no progress was made in either case until 1995, when police finally linked the second victim's murder to a family friend who had since passed away. As a result, the case was closed, and investigators ceased to consider it related to April's murder. Detectives waited for the perpetrator to make contact again, as his initial message suggested he reveled in mocking the police and flaunting his apparent impunity. However, as the years went by, no new messages surfaced. The case remained stagnant until 2004, when it took a dramatic turn. A Fort Wayne girl discovered a plastic zip bag in her bike basket containing a chilling note that left her shaken. She promptly showed it to her parents, who alerted the authorities. The note read, "Hello dear, I've been watching you. I'm the one who kidnapped, assaulted, and killed April Tensley. I have a gift for you. You'll be my next victim if you don't report this to the police, and I don't see this note in tomorrow's local news. I'll destroy your home, killing everyone but you. You'll be mine." The police had no doubt that the note's author was indeed April's killer. Inside the bag with the note was a used condom sent to the laboratory for analysis. By 2004, DNA profiling had become a routine tool, and experts had already extracted a profile from the semen found on April's body. Now the analysis revealed that the biological sample from the condom matched the same individual, but he was not in the FBI database. The police reopened April's case and soon received a report of a second note. Another girl had found a plastic bag containing a similar message, including a used condom with the same man's DNA. The perpetrator had written that he had killed April Tinsley and threatened to kill this girl as well. In the following months, the police received 2 more calls about similar notes found by other girls. This time, the perpetrator had attached Polaroid photos of his genitalia, which investigators examined for clues. Although all they noticed was a green pattern on the bedsheet in the background, they tried to locate stores selling similar bedding, but it didn't lead to a breakthrough. Within just a few months, the perpetrator had left a total of 4 notes, but then fell silent for years. Once again, in 2009, the FBI released a detailed profile of the killer, including witness-identified physical characteristics, but unfortunately, it yielded no leads. For Fort Wayne investigators, this case remained a top priority for several compelling reasons. Firstly, and most importantly, they were driven to achieve justice and bring the perpetrator who took April's life to account. The killer's audacity was further demonstrated by his taunting messages to the police, which suggested he believed he would never be caught, and his threats against other girls. In a brazen move, he left behind his DNA for detectives to find, providing them with numerous biological samples. However, despite the wealth of evidence, April's killer remained absent from the FBI's database over the years, indicating he had avoided serious criminal convictions and continued to live freely. In 2012, a popular television program about unsolved crimes featured April's case, generating a fresh wave of tips, but each one ultimately led to a dead end. In 2015, detectives reopened the investigation and turned to Parabon, a company that provided law enforcement agencies with a novel service, creating portraits of individuals based on their DNA samples. This innovative approach had already successfully solved several cases. Investigators shared the portrait of the suspect in April's case online and with the media, hoping someone would recognize the person. However, luck was not on their side, and they didn't receive any valuable leads, but the police remained determined. Years later, in 2018, they contacted Parabon again, this time to explore genetic genealogy, a pioneering approach. This method involves experts taking a DNA sample and scouring publicly available genetic databases for any relatives of the DNA owner, no matter how distant. They typically find thousands of people, then study their family trees to identify someone who matches the perpetrator's criteria, such as gender, age, location at the time of the crime, and more. The unique aspect of this method is that the DNA owner doesn't need to be in a database. They can be identified solely through a long chain of relatives. Detectives working on April's case sent the killer's DNA sample to Parabon once again, waiting patiently for the results. The process of tracing relatives and studying their family trees was a lengthy one, requiring experts to sift through vast amounts of data over several months. Eventually, they informed the detectives that they had traced the DNA lineage to two brothers living in Fort Wayne. Now, the police had to determine which of the brothers was the killer. They placed both men under surveillance, collecting their trash in the hopes of extracting DNA samples. It wasn't long before the experts called the detectives with the long-awaited news. 30 years after the murder, they had found a perfect match. The DNA taken from the victim's body and the condoms matched the DNA of one of the brothers, 59-year-old John Miller, who lived in the small town of Grail, not far from where April's body was found. At the time of the murder, he was 29 years old and resided in the same trailer. The police decided to obtain a direct DNA sample from Miller and interrogate him. When they arrived at his trailer and asked him to accompany them to the station, he astutely guessed they were there about April Tinsley. On the way to the station, Miller engaged in small talk, appearing remarkably relaxed. At the interrogation, Miller neither denied nor contested the allegations and confessed to abducting, sexually assaulting, and murdering April. He claimed to have deliberately targeted Fort Wayne, spotting April on a deserted street and telling her to get into his car, to which she silently acquiesced. He then took her to his trailer, where he assaulted and killed her before dumping her body. Miller's lawyer advised him to plead not guilty to protract the legal process. However, he was offered a deal. In exchange for admitting guilt, the death penalty would be commuted to an 80-year prison sentence. Miller accepted the deal, admitted his guilt, and received the 80-year sentence. April's mother was disappointed that Miller escaped the death penalty, but given his advanced age, it is unlikely he will ever be released. April's father, on the other hand, thanked the investigators for their tireless efforts in finding his daughter's killer. The detectives believe Miller had a motive for wanting to be caught. He deliberately courted attention, taking risks such as leaving DNA samples at the crime scene. They suspect he was either prepared to be found out or actively sought it. Chad Derman, a 32-year-old resident of Claremont County, Ohio, was married to 34-year-old Laura. Together, they had a blended family consisting of Laura's 16-year-old teenage daughter, Alexis, from a previous relationship, and their three young sons, Hunter, Clayton, and Chase, aged 3, 4, and 7, respectively. The three boys were inseparable, shared a love for sports, and were known for their humorous and affectionate nature. Laura was a stay-at-home mom, while Chad worked to provide for the family. They resided in a modest 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house in New Richmond, a small town of approximately 2,000 people situated along the Ohio River in Claremont County. Until tragedy struck, they lived an ordinary and unassuming life. On June 15, 2023, Chad returned home from work earlier than usual and decided to take a nap with his family. He invited his wife Laura and their 3 sons to join him in their bedroom, where they all sat together, laughing and chatting. Unbeknownst to Laura, this loving moment was about to turn into a nightmare. After a few minutes, Chad got up and opened the gun safe beside their bed, loaded the Marlin Model HC-22 rifle, and shot his 4-year-old son Hunter twice. Meanwhile, their daughter Alexis was watching TV in the family room when she heard the gunshot. She rushed to the bedroom and witnessed the horrific scene of her brother being shot as she reached the doorway. Terrified, Alexis turned and ran as fast as she could. Laura, who was with her children, rushed to help her child Hunter. She then yelled at the other kids to flee and save themselves. Alexis saw the oldest boy running out the wrong door towards a field and shouted at him to keep going. Chad followed him, and moments later, he shot his 7-year-old son Clayton. After Clayton fell to the ground, bleeding badly, Chad stood next to him, seemingly triumphant. Alexis witnessed the entire scene, horrified. She then ran into the house, grabbed her youngest brother, and escaped to safety, desperate to protect their lives. Chad chased after Alexis and caught up to her, raising his gun and ordering her to put down the 3-year-old Chase. Alexis wept and begged Chad not to shoot her, pleading with him to stop. Chad attempted to shoot her in the head, but luckily he had just run out of bullets. Alexis fled to the nearby fire station, where she stopped a passing woman and urgently told her that her stepfather had killed her entire family. She then called 911 at 4:15 p.m. She was running down the street saying her stepfather had killed everyone in her family. She called 911 and explained that she said her stepfather was killing everybody in her house. The 911 operator asked if she could tell how many people had been shot. She replied that she thought it was 2 children. Meanwhile, 3-year-old Chase was reunited with his mother. However, a heated argument erupted between Chad and Laura over custody of Chase. Chad attempted to wrestle Chase away from Laura, but she clung to him desperately, trying to shield him from harm. In a shocking turn of events, Chad bit Laura and then pressed the gun to her thumb, firing it. Severely wounded, Laura released her grip on Chase. Chad then callously shot Chase in the head. Afterwards, he coldly arranged the lifeless bodies of all 3 children in a straight line. Having committed the atrocities, Chad sat calmly on his front porch, feigning nonchalance, while Laura lay inside the house, screaming for help. Following the 911 call, police officers arrived at the scene at 4:25 p.m. When they arrived, they found Chad sitting on his porch, a rifle beside him. The officers promptly apprehended him and put him in handcuffs. Chad displayed a calm demeanor and offered no resistance. While one officer restrained him, another tended to the 3 victims. Despite their efforts, paramedics were unable to save the children, who succumbed to their gunshot wounds. Laura was subsequently rushed to the University of Cincinnati Medical Center to receive treatment for her injuries. Chad Derman's stepdaughter, Alexis, was fortunate to have escaped the tragic events alive. On June 15, 2023, she managed to flee the house, the same day Chad killed his 3 sons. The police arrested him at 4:27 p.m. When officers apprehended him, he displayed a surprising calmness and politeness, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Subsequently, he was taken into custody for further questioning and investigation. During the interrogation, Chad Derman confessed to the police that he had been planning the murders since October 2022. He also revealed to the investigators that he had gone without sleep for 3 to 4 days, overwhelmed by the unbearable thought of killing his own sons. These confessions provided a disturbing insight into his state of mind in the lead-up to the tragic events. The investigation continued, focusing on whether Chad had a history of violent behavior. To this end, investigators examined his phone records, which showed that he had mainly been cited for traffic violations in Claremont County, with one exception, an incident when he was 18 involving criminal damage. Furthermore, they discovered a domestic violence case from 2010 in which Chad was accused of choking his father, Keith Derman. However, the case was eventually dropped when Keith Derman failed to appear in court to testify for the prosecution. These records provided valuable insight into Chad's legal history and his past interactions with law enforcement in the county. During the investigation, a neighbor, Richard Van Kanen, shared his observations with a news channel, stating that Chad was consistently angry, yelling at his wife and kids, and belittling them. The woman who had called 911 also gave an interview to the news channel, describing how she had been running with her little black lab, screaming for someone to call 911 because her stepfather was shooting everyone in her household. Investigators looked into whether Derman was experiencing financial difficulties. They discovered that he had bought a converted manufactured home on a 3-acre property in 2016 for $75,000 and had been paying his property taxes up to 2023, suggesting that he wasn't having trouble with his mortgage payments. Detectives also spoke with Keith Derman, Chad's 59-year-old father. He was in a state of complete shock upon learning what his son had done and couldn't fathom how his child could commit such a heinous act. The father revealed that Chad had been dealing with some personal issue that had become too much for him to handle and that he might have kept many things hidden from him. Keith Derman tearfully described Chad as a good kid, expressing deep distress over the situation. On June 23, 2023, Chad initially entered a guilty plea and confessed to his crimes during the first court hearing. However, in a surprising turn of events, he later maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty to the charges against him during the subsequent court hearing on the same day. The judge described the case as an evil horror that was impossible to process and incomprehensible cruelty. The tragic events unfolded when the father, who stood before the court, brutally executed his 3 young sons, aged 3, 4, and 7, in his own home using a rifle. David Gast, chief prosecutor of the municipal court in Claremont County, revealed shocking details about the case, stating that Chad had meticulously planned the events. Chad's son had attempted to escape in a nearby field, but Chad chased, caught, and returned him to the yard, where he was brutally killed along with his brothers. According to Gast, the trauma inflicted by Chad on his family, community, law enforcement, and first responders is unimaginable. The prosecutor emphasized that Chad's admission of guilt in this case has left them grappling with the sheer horror of his actions. He described Chad's killing of his sons as one of the most heinous, craven, and cowardly acts they will ever encounter. The bill of particulars, filed in Claremont County, revealed the full extent of the crime. Gast explained that Chad deliberately lined up the boys and shot them, confirming that Chad himself admitted to planning the killings. When the mother intervened, she was shot in the hand. The prosecutor disclosed that Chad fired 9 shots, causing catastrophic harm, with 1 boy hit once and the other 2 each shot 4 times. The prosecutor, Mark Talvey, described to the judge the cruel manner in which Chad Dorman murdered his 3 sons, leaving the family and community in shock. Chad confessed to the crime, stating that he had done it and should be taken to jail, expressing regret and acknowledging that he shouldn't have shot them. Talvey emphasized that he would push for the death penalty for Chad Dorman. Initially, Chad faced 21 charges related to the tragic events that occurred on June 15, 2023. Specifically, he was accused of shooting and killing his 3 young children, 4-year-old Hunter, 7-year-old Clayton, and 3-year-old Chase, in an execution-style manner. The grand jury has now indicted Chad on 21 counts, including 9 counts of aggravated murder, 8 counts of kidnapping, and 4 counts of felony assault, which could lead to the death penalty if convicted. Claremont County Municipal Court Judge Jason Nagel ruled that Chad Dorman should be held in the Claremont County Jail and set his bail at a record-breaking $20 million. During a subsequent court hearing, Dorman's lawyer requested that the death penalty be removed from consideration, arguing that Dorman was severely mentally ill when he fatally shot his 3 sons on June 15, 2023. Dorman has since pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity nearly 9 months after the incident. The Claremont County prosecutors allege that Dorman deliberately killed his 3 young sons. Experts will reassess Dorman's mental state at the time of the murders. Dorman's lawyer maintains that executing someone with severe mental illness is cruel and unusual punishment, violating both the Ohio and U.S. constitutions. Those suffering from severe mental illness at the time of the alleged offense are not as morally responsible as others. The prosecution has requested a mental evaluation, and a court date was set for May 3, 2024, to discuss the lawyer's request. Chad's lawyers had agreed to provide a report from a mental health expert by June 3, 2024, to support their claim that he was mentally ill when the crime occurred. During a March 2024 court hearing, Chad's lawyers contended that the Claremont County Sheriff's deputies failed to uphold his Miranda rights following his arrest. The judge has subsequently ruled that Chad Dorman's confession, allegedly given during his interrogation, will be dismissed this Friday. The judge's decision was based on the grounds that the defendant's rights were violated on two separate occasions. Firstly, when police omitted parts of the Miranda warnings, and secondly, when detectives continued questioning Chad Dorman after he requested an attorney. The prosecution called several witnesses, including police officers who responded to the scene, to describe their encounters with Chad. According to prosecutors, almost all of Chad's interactions with the sheriff's deputies and detectives were recorded. The first witness to testify in court was Claremont County Deputy Chad P. Mann, a canine handler deputy. Deputy P. Mann stated that he was the first officer to arrive at the scene, and the first thing he noticed was the defendant sitting on the porch near a rifle. After a lengthy court hearing, Judge Richard Fank ruled that the investigators failed to follow proper procedure during Chad's arrest in June 2023, violating his Miranda rights. Chad's lawyers argued that he requested a lawyer at least twice during his 3-hour interrogation, but detectives ignored his requests and continued questioning him. They also claimed that Chad's initial guilty plea was a result of pressure from investigators. The judge's decision stated that the detectives did not fully inform Chad of his rights before the interrogation, making any statements he made during that time inadmissible in future court proceedings. This ruling significantly impacted the trial, limiting the evidence that could be presented against Chad and adding complexity to the legal process, which has heightened public interest in the case. If convicted, Chad faces the death penalty, with his trial set to begin in July. However, this recent ruling may alter the course of the trial. A final court hearing is scheduled for June 14th, just before the anniversary of the incident, and the trial is expected to take place from July 8th to August 2nd, 2024. The motive behind Chad's actions remains unknown. Speculation suggests that he may have been motivated by a belief that his 34-year-old wife was cheating on him, but this is unconfirmed. Earlier, hundreds attended a fundraiser for the victim's family, which the community sees as the least they can do to support them while the boy's father awaits trial for their murders. A memorial service was held on June 26th at First Baptist Church of Glenestee to honor the three boys. At the family's request, community members wore bright colors. The community is still grappling with the tragedy of the shootings and the loss of 3 innocent lives. Outpourings of support for the family, friends, classmates, and first responders continue to grow, showing no signs of slowing. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Elizabeth Smart. On June 5, 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was asleep in her bedroom in the affluent town of Federal Heights, Salt Lake City, Utah, sharing the room with her sister Mary Catherine. As the night wore on, their peaceful slumber was shattered. A soft-spoken man, armed with a knife, forced open a window in the girl's room, disturbing Mary Catherine, who pretended to be asleep in an attempt to protect her sister. The intruder then turned to Elizabeth, ordering her to remain silent, threatening to harm her if she didn't comply. Fearing for her life, Elizabeth obeyed, putting on shoes before being taken outside the house. Meanwhile, Mary Catherine lay still for 2 hours, waiting for the perfect moment to alert her parents, Ed and Lois Smart. When she finally woke them up, she told them that someone had taken Elizabeth, but her parents were initially skeptical, thinking their daughter might have been dreaming. However, as the events began to unfold, they took Mary Catherine's story seriously. After inspecting Elizabeth and Mary Catherine's bedroom, Ed and Lois found a cut window screen, which corroborated Mary Catherine's story. Concerned for Elizabeth's safety, Ed and Lois promptly notified the authorities. The police arrived at the Smart family home and questioned Mary Catherine about the man who had abducted Elizabeth from their bedroom. Mary Catherine described the abductor as having dark hair on his arms and the backs of his hands. Although the man had spoken quietly to Elizabeth during the incident, Mary Catherine could still identify his voice as somehow familiar, even though she couldn't recall any specific occasion when she had heard it before. About 3.5 hours after Elizabeth was taken, the authorities used the Betrayal alert system to broadcast information about her abduction to the public. The Betrayal alert, named after a Utah girl who was abducted and murdered, enabled the authorities to rapidly disseminate information to a wide audience and enlist the public's help in locating Elizabeth. The police investigated people who had toured the Smart family's home, which was up for sale, as potential suspects in Elizabeth's abduction since she had been taken from her bedroom on June 5, 2002. Additionally, they searched the family's computer, seeking any online interactions Elizabeth may have had with strangers, as this was a common tactic used in child abduction cases. The day after Elizabeth's kidnapping, her devastated parents, Ed and Lois, made a heartfelt and emotional appeal on national television, pleading for her safe return. Ed addressed the perpetrator directly, his voice filled with desperation and love, asking them to bring their daughter home. With tears in his eyes, he begged the person responsible to have mercy and return Elizabeth safely, expressing his immense love for his daughter and his unwavering commitment to finding her. In Federal Heights, the police interviewed Elizabeth's neighbors, but none of them reported seeing or hearing anything unusual on the day she was abducted. The lack of information was surprising to the police, who had hoped to gather more leads to aid the investigation. Following Elizabeth's abduction, Rocky Anderson, the mayor of Salt Lake City, made a public announcement offering an initial reward of $10,000 for her safe return to her family. This amount was later increased to $250,000. A massive search effort was launched, with nearly 12,200 volunteers joining Elizabeth's family and friends to look for her. However, at a news conference, the police admitted that despite receiving thousands of tips, their progress in the case was limited. The authorities in Salt Lake City solicited assistance from other police departments statewide, but lacked crucial evidence, such as a vehicle description, to pursue significant leads. As a result, the investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance stagnated, causing frustration among law enforcement officials. Captain Scott Atkinson of the Salt Lake City Police Department publicly stated that all individuals were still suspects in Elizabeth's abduction, while reaffirming that her family was not the primary focus of the investigation. A volunteer searching for Elizabeth reported a suspicious man to the police after spotting him in a wooded canyon. The volunteer described the man's suspicious behavior, prompting the police to launch an overnight search. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find the man and eventually dismissed the tip as not credible. The police also received a tip from a local milkman in Federal Heights. He claimed to have seen a man driving an older gray Honda or Nissan on Elizabeth Street a day or two before her disappearance. The milkman said he felt uneasy about the driver and wrote down the license plate number. However, when the police checked their database for the license plate number, they couldn't find any relevant information or leads, so they dismissed the tip as not viable. The police officers investigating Elizabeth Smart's abduction faced a significant challenge due to the large number of people who gathered at the Smart residence in the hours immediately following her abduction. When the police arrived at the scene around 4 a.m., they found the home already crowded with people, which compromised the integrity of any potential evidence. As the search for Elizabeth Smart continued, the police questioned a man who had interacted with her at a social event prior to her abduction. However, they soon cleared him of any suspicion and determined he had no involvement in her disappearance. The search efforts intensified, with over 20 volunteer pilots flying their private planes over the Salt Lake area, but unfortunately, these efforts yielded no results. Tracking dogs picked up a scent in Red Boot Canyon, several miles from Elizabeth's home, but police searched the area and found nothing. The search for Elizabeth had taken a toll on her father, Ed Smart, who was on the verge of exhaustion. He collapsed from the strain and was taken to the hospital, but was released a few hours later and continued searching for his daughter. Ed and his wife, Lois, were utterly exhausted, unable to sleep, and barely holding on. In a media interview, Ed expressed his frustration and determination to find Elizabeth, stating that they were holding on to hope that their daughter was alive and would soon return home to them. Despite their exhaustion, Ed and Lois Smart remained hopeful that Elizabeth would come back to them. Elizabeth's mother, Lois Smart, publicly declared her love and devotion to her daughter through a heartfelt statement to the media, saying, "Elizabeth, if you can hear us, we love you." Her loved ones gathered for a candlelight vigil, praying for her safe return home. Following Elizabeth's abduction, the police asked her father, Ed, to take a polygraph test, which he willingly agreed to, demonstrating his family's cooperation in aiding the authorities to locate their daughter. The investigation subsequently ruled out the possibility that Elizabeth had staged her own disappearance and confirmed that she did not run away. Police got a tip about Brett Michael Edmonds, who was sighted in Federal Heights around Elizabeth's abduction time. They looked for him but couldn't find him. He'd moved to New Mexico and Texas. After a chase, they caught a guy who looked like him, but it wasn't him. The police eventually located Brett Michael Edmonds in West Virginia, where he had been hospitalized due to an overdose and liver failure. Although his health was critical and there were fears he might not survive, his condition stabilized enough to allow authorities to question him about Elizabeth's abduction. In a fortunate turn of events, Brett was conscious, alert, and able to speak, enabling the police and FBI agents to interview him. During the interview, Brett fully cooperated with the authorities, who ultimately concluded that he was not involved in Elizabeth's abduction. After Brett Michael Edmonds was cleared as a suspect in Elizabeth's abduction, police turned their attention to 48-year-old Richard Albert Ritchie. Elizabeth's father, Ed Smart, informed police that he had employed Richard at his home for 2 months the previous year. Ed said that since Richard didn't own a vehicle, they made a deal. Ed would give Richard his 1990 Jeep Cherokee in exchange for his labor. However, Ed was unaware that Richard Ritchie was a career criminal, and he later stated that if he had known about Richard's background, he wouldn't have hired him. Richard Ritchie's criminal history dates back to 1973, when he was convicted of second-degree felony burglary, marking the start of a string of offenses over several decades. In 1981, he was convicted of burglary for a separate incident. His most serious crime occurred in 1983, when he was sent to prison for aggravated robbery and attempted murder after wounding a police officer during a gunfire exchange with authorities during a drugstore robbery. Additionally, Richard Ritchie was convicted of theft in 1996 for stealing approximately $2,500 worth of food from a food pantry in Richfield. Corrections records show that Richard Ritchie was paroled in September 2000. In a media interview, Ed Smart expressed doubts about Richard Ritchie's involvement in his daughter Elizabeth's abduction. Despite Ritchie's criminal history, Ed initially thought him a capable worker. On June 14, 2002, Richard Ritchie was arrested for a parole violation. The police could not confirm his whereabouts on the day Elizabeth was abducted. Richard Ritchie denied any involvement through his attorney and stated that the police had thoroughly searched his home, including digging up his garden. Despite this, no evidence related to Elizabeth's abduction was found. Ritchie claimed he fully cooperated with the police, providing blood samples for DNA comparison and sitting through 26 hours of interviews. He also handed over his vehicle for investigation. By July 2002, Elizabeth Smart had been missing for a month, and her family was desperate for her return. When police received a report of a girl matching Elizabeth's description in Nebraska under suspicious circumstances, they thought their prayers had been answered. A gas station witness reported seeing a crying girl, aged 12 to 14, who seemed to be held against her will in a minivan. The witness provided a detailed description that matched Elizabeth's appearance. This news sent shockwaves through the Smart family, who eagerly hoped for any lead that might help find their missing daughter. However, a thorough police investigation revealed that the report was unrelated to Elizabeth's abduction. Despite a thorough search, police found no evidence linking the sighting to Elizabeth's case. This disappointment left the Smart family struggling with mixed emotions as they continued to hope for Elizabeth's safe return while acknowledging the possibility of false leads. Undeterred, the Smart family remained determined to find Elizabeth, maintaining a cautious optimism. They refused to rule out the possibility that the girl at the gas station was Elizabeth, but stated that they needed to keep an open mind. The family spokesperson clarified that while they weren't necessarily holding out hope that it was Elizabeth, they would be overjoyed if it were. Richard Ritchie, the main suspect in Elizabeth's disappearance, was charged with theft and burglary in two separate incidents. One incident occurred on April 4, 2001, when he allegedly stole items from a house in the Federal Heights neighborhood, which is a second-degree felony and a Class A misdemeanor. The other incident happened on June 6, 2001, when he allegedly stole jewelry and a perfume bottle valued at approximately $3,500 from the Smart family home, which is a third-degree felony. Ritchie pleaded not guilty to these charges. The stolen items were not related to Elizabeth's kidnapping investigation. Salt Lake District Attorney David Yoakum announced the charges at a press conference, stating that Ritchie had denied the theft allegations and was subsequently fired from his job. In August 2002, the police investigation into Elizabeth Smart's abduction hit a major roadblock when Richard Ritchie, their best lead, died from a severe brainstem injury that caused bleeding. Ritchie's condition worsened rapidly, leaving him unable to communicate or breathe on his own. His family made the painful decision to take him off life support in a last-ditch effort to save his life. Although doctors operated to remove a blood clot from his brain and relieve pressure on his brainstem, the damage was too extensive and their efforts were in vain. Despite this setback, the authorities persisted in their search for Elizabeth Smart's abductor. However, Ritchie's death posed a significant obstacle to the investigation, undermining confidence in other leads and hindering progress in the case. In August 2002, a horrific crime was committed when an 11-year-old girl was taken from her bedroom and subjected to sexual assault and brutal beating. The severity of her injuries was appalling, with every bone in the middle of her face broken, as revealed by hospital doctors. She required surgery, but sadly, her condition remained critical after the attack. The police investigation led to the arrest of Javier Sickler, a close friend of the girl's father, who was charged with aggravated burglary, aggravated assault, and attempted murder. Javier Sickler claimed that he remembered knocking on the front door of the victim's home, but alleged that he lost consciousness afterward. Despite initial similarities with the Elizabeth Smart abduction case, the police established that Javier Sickler was not involved in her kidnapping. As the search for Elizabeth Smart dragged on, the police began to explore unconventional approaches. They consulted psychics, individuals claiming to possess extrasensory perception that could uncover clues about her location. One tip from these psychics suggested that Elizabeth might be buried in a crypt in the foothills above Salt Lake City. This prompted a Seattle-based company to step forward, claiming that over a dozen of its members had pinpointed Elizabeth's body using a technique called technical remote viewing. According to these individuals, their psychic powers had revealed that Elizabeth was killed within hours of her abduction. However, when the police investigated the alleged tomb, they found no evidence of Elizabeth's whereabouts. In November 2002, Walter Kenneth Holloway was arrested after claiming to be the kidnapper of Elizabeth Smart and demanding a $3 million ransom from her parents, Ed and Lois Smart. Holloway contacted the Smart family and the Salt Lake Police Department, threatening to harm Elizabeth if he didn't receive the money. However, the police tracked him down to South Carolina and found no evidence linking him to her abduction. Ed Smart was outraged by the extortion scheme, which he felt diverted police attention away from finding his daughter and wasted resources that could have been used to locate her. In October 2002, Elizabeth's sister Mary Catherine had a sudden realization. The voice of the abductor was identical to that of Emmanuel, an unemployed man the family had briefly hired to work on their roof and rake leaves in their yard. Although the police were initially skeptical, due to the short duration of Emmanuel's employment with the family, the long delay between the abduction and Mary Catherine's revelation, and her limited exposure to the abductor's voice, the family decided to have a sketch artist draw Emmanuel's likeness based on their descriptions. The resulting sketch was finally released in February 2003 and received widespread media attention, featuring on prominent television shows such as Larry King Live and America's Most Wanted. Relatives of a man named Brian David Mitchell identified a suspect drawing released by the police. They provided contemporary photographs of him, which helped authorities verify that the sketch was an accurate likeness. On March 12, 2003, two couples in Sandy, Utah, recognized Brian David Mitchell walking with a woman and a girl who they knew from the news as the missing girl's abductor. The woman accompanying Mitchell was later identified as his wife, Wanda Berry. The couples quickly called the police, and officers were sent to the location. After questioning, the missing girl from Salt Lake City, Elizabeth Smart, was confirmed to be present. The officers then rescued her and arrested both Mitchell and Berry. Elizabeth provided a shocking account of being abducted, abused, and held captive. Brian David Mitchell had taken her from her home to an encampment outside Salt Lake City. The camp was a makeshift shelter hidden by dense foliage for camouflage. There, she met Wanda Berry, Mitchell's wife, who played a significant role in her captivity. At first, Wanda Berry acted like a caring mother figure, offering Elizabeth comfort and warmth. However, as the weeks passed, Berry's behavior changed dramatically. She began controlling Elizabeth, forcing her to follow their strange religious beliefs. Berry demanded that Elizabeth pray, read scriptures, and take part in religious rituals. Elizabeth faced a highly traumatic experience during her captivity when she was forced to marry Brian David Mitchell against her will. Wanda Berry threatened her with physical harm if she refused to comply with their demands. The wedding ceremony, which Mitchell pretended was a symbol of eternal love, was actually a sham with no legal validity, serving only to reinforce Brian David Mitchell's control over Elizabeth. After forcing Elizabeth into marriage, Brian David Mitchell began assaulting her. He claimed he was a Davidic king, tasked by a higher power to kidnap virgins to fight the Antichrist, as a justification for his actions. During her captivity, Elizabeth suffered unimaginable abuse, including being chained to a tree with a metal cable that severely restricted her movement and prevented her from escaping. In addition to physical restraint, Elizabeth was also subjected to psychological manipulation. She was forced to take the new name Esther, inspired by the biblical figure, which symbolized the loss of her identity and the control exerted over her by Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Berry. Elizabeth was repeatedly sexually assaulted by Brian David Mitchell, leaving her traumatized and fearful. She was also forced to look at explicit magazines, further worsening her trauma and degradation. Throughout her ordeal, Elizabeth was constantly threatened with violence and even death, leaving her in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety. To weaken Elizabeth's resistance, Mitchell frequently forced her to consume alcohol and take drugs, exploiting these substances to break down her defenses and make her more susceptible to his control. The constant intoxication left her disoriented, vulnerable, and disconnected from reality, making it easier for her captors to commit their atrocities. Moreover, Elizabeth was subjected to starvation and fed scraps by her captors. After her rescue, Elizabeth described Wanda Berry as the most evil woman she had ever encountered. Following years of legal proceedings, Wanda Berry pleaded guilty to all charges related to Elizabeth's abduction and was sentenced to concurrent 15-year terms in state and federal prison in 2016. Her federal imprisonment was eventually terminated, and she was transferred from the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, to the Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah, to begin serving her state prison sentence. Elizabeth Smart spoke out against the release of Wanda Barzee in September 2018, despite which Barzee was still set free. At the time, Smart, an advocate for child safety, expressed concern that Barzee still posed a threat to others, citing her lack of remorse and signs of rehabilitation. The controversy surrounding Barzee's release drew media attention and highlighted ongoing concerns about the parole of convicted criminals. After years of legal battles, Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping Elizabeth Smart. During the hearing, Elizabeth addressed her kidnapper directly, delivering a powerful and emotional statement. She described the pain and trauma he had inflicted, telling him that the 9 months in captivity had taken an irreplaceable part of her life. Despite this, Elizabeth showed remarkable resilience and determination, vowing to lead a good life despite the darkness he had brought into her life. Her words reflected her strength and determination to overcome her challenges. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Jessica Knott. Jessica Knott was born on June 22, 1986, in the city of Allamont Springs, Florida. She had an older brother, a younger sister, and loving parents. Her father worked as a construction worker, often traveling to other states for several days, leaving the kids alone with their mother. Jessica was a cheerful and lovely child. She liked to spend a lot of time outdoors with friends, play with her siblings, and she also had a deep love for animals. On April 5, 1996, when Jessica was 9 years old, her family decided to visit her grandparents for Easter. That day, her father went to the store to buy some items for the holiday, while her mother stayed in their apartment, packing for the upcoming trip. Jessica returned home from school with other children and asked her mother if she could go to the yard. She wanted to wait for her father, who was expected to return from the store soon. Her mother agreed and told her daughter not to go anywhere else. Their apartment complex was situated away from the main road, surrounded by trees, and the mother felt relatively secure about Jessica's safety. All the neighborhood children, including Jessica, always played there without constant adult supervision, and everything had been fine. A few hours later, around 6 p.m., her father returned home and asked his wife where Jessica was. She was surprised, as her daughter was supposed to be in the yard waiting for her father, but he claimed she wasn't there. The parents went outside and searched the entire yard, but they couldn't find Jessica. Frustrated, they decided to check with neighbors, hoping someone had seen their daughter. One neighbor mentioned seeing Jessica in the yard earlier. She was sitting on a bench and reading a book, but that didn't help the worried parents find her. As darkness fell and their daughter remained missing, they decided to call the police. Officers arrived in a few minutes, initiated a search, and started interviewing neighbors. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find Jessica, so the police expanded the search area to nearby streets. A few hours later, an unexpected call came into the police station. The caller provided sparse details, but the police raced to the pumping station, finding Jessica's body hidden nearby in a trash bag, mere yards from the road, but obscured by the bridge's location. Personal effects by the corpse suggested the tragic circumstances. Meanwhile, the investigators focused on tracing the 911 call. It was evident that the call came from the murderer, and the police hoped it could help identify them. But there was a challenge. The call was made from a public payphone at a gas station less than a mile from the crime scene, and by the time the officers arrived, the perpetrator had already vanished. Detectives tried to find fingerprints on the phone, but it was a challenge. It was a public payphone, so there might be multiple prints. Moreover, investigators realized that the criminal had likely wiped the phone after the call or used gloves. Experts concluded that Jessica was killed elsewhere, and her body was transported to the water pumping station. Traces on the ground in front of the facility indicated that the killer likely pulled the body from a vehicle in a trash bag and dragged it across the ground. Jessica's clothing was intact, except for one shoe. Police couldn't find it in the bag or in the surrounding area. The only lead found at the crime scene was the tire track on the ground. Police couldn't be certain it belonged to the killer's vehicle, but they photographed it and made a cast. Medical experts examined the body and determined that the victim died from strangulation based on marks on her face and neck. It seemed the killer had used their bare hands. A partially digested hamburger was found in her stomach, which she had consumed less than an hour before her death. Her mother stated that she had not provided Jessica with any such food that day, leading the police to believe that the meal was provided by the killer. Experts also found no signs of sexual assault, leaving the motive of the perpetrator entirely unclear. Initially, the police began to consider Jessica's parents as suspects, as neither of them had a solid alibi. At the time of Jessica's disappearance, her mother claimed she was packing in the apartment, and the father was shopping. Theoretically, they both had the opportunity to commit the crime. The police tried to understand how the killer managed to take Jessica from her complex's yard without anyone noticing or Jessica screaming. This led them to believe that the perpetrator likely knew the victim well, and she left with him willingly. Another supporting factor was the tone of the killer's voice during the 911 call. Despite the experts' efforts to clean up the recording, they noticed sorrow and regret in the killer's voice, as if they genuinely regretted committing the murder. The fact that the killer took the risk of calling 911 spoke volumes. The perpetrator could have done it either for the thrill of playing with the police and manipulating the investigation, or they genuinely regretted their actions and wanted to somehow alleviate that feeling. Considering the caller's evident sadness, investigators leaned towards the second option. Police inspected Jessica's father's car, finding something intriguing in the trunk. There was a roll of black trash bags similar to the one containing the victim's body. However, an expert examining the bag from the crime scene quickly determined it differed from those found in the father's car, clearly belonging to a different roll. So the man was temporarily ruled out as a suspect, and investigators shifted their focus to others. Forensic experts carefully examined the victim's clothing and body for potential clues, uncovering a few leads. They discovered a substantial amount of dog hair, despite the fact that Jessica's family did not own a dog, suggesting the animal belonged to the killer. Additionally, they found human hair on her body belonging to an unknown white male. However, the experts required a few days to extract the DNA profile. Two types of foreign fibers were also discovered on Jessica's clothes. Through analysis of their structure, the experts concluded that one likely came from a car seat cover and the other from a carpet, further supporting the theory that the victim was killed elsewhere and transported to the water pumping station by car. Regarding the dog hair found on Jessica's clothing, experts attempted to determine the breed using the FBI's database, which contained microscopic photos of hair from various dog breeds. This database has been helpful in criminal cases where dog hair could be crucial evidence. Experts compared the hair sample with the database, ruling out one breed after another. Ultimately, they concluded that the hair on the victim's clothes belonged to a Shar-Pei. It appears the killer owned a Shar-Pei, and the hair ended up on Jessica's clothes, either in the perpetrator's vehicle or at their residence. According to the preliminary theory of investigators, the killer somehow might have lured Jessica into his car, taken her to McDonald's for a hamburger, and then brought her to his home and murdered her. Meanwhile, the experts attempted to enhance the phone call recording, but it proved to be a challenging task. They decided to try a different approach and sought assistance from NASA. NASA had advanced tools for clearing audio recordings, originally designed to enhance recordings from space. They agreed to help and provided the police with a higher quality audio track. However, the experts still needed a voice sample from the suspect to compare it with the call recording and establish a match. Based on the detectives' assumption that the killer might have known Jessica, they decided to play the call recording for her mother, hoping she could recognize it. She listened to it for the first time and said that the voice sounded familiar, but the mother couldn't remember whose voice it is. However, during a second attempt, it clicked. She recognized the voice as their neighbor who lived in the same complex, although she couldn't remember his name. She told the detectives that the man often walked his Shar-Pei in the yard. Police swiftly identified the man as 35-year-old James Crow. During the initial hours of Jessica's disappearance, investigators had already questioned him along with other neighbors. He mentioned that he saw her in the yard while walking his dog, and they spoke briefly before he left. Detectives dug into his background and found that Crow had no criminal history. He lived with his wife, who was a nurse. The man was a former truck driver, currently unemployed, and he spent most of his time strolling the streets with a Shar-Pei named Pumpkin. The detectives realized that merely the similarity in voice and owning a dog of a specific breed wasn't enough for an arrest, so they obtained a search warrant for his car. They discovered two disturbing clues. Under the front passenger seat, there was an empty Happy Meal bag, even though Jessica had a McDonald's hamburger in her stomach and James didn't have children. This seemed highly suspicious. Experts also noticed that the car had brand new tires, as if they had barely been used. Police found out that Crow replaced them on the day of Jessica's murder, even though his previous tires were not particularly old and could have lasted for several more years. Crow claimed to have left the old tires at a car service, which was quite unusual considering they were not old at all. So the police headed to this service building, but by the time they arrived, there was only one tire from James's car left. They compared its tread pattern from what was found near the body, but detectives faced an unexpected twist. They didn't match. However, they initially weren't 100% sure that the tire mark on the ground was left by the killer's car and not some other vehicle, as maintenance staff regularly visited the building, and this tire mark could have belonged to their vehicle. The police also searched James's apartment, where they found a new lead, a box containing several rolls of trash bags matching the size and color of the one found on the victim's body. Obviously, this couldn't be considered strong evidence, so detectives had to figure out if there was a way to establish that the bags had come from the same roll. At first glance, this task seemed impossible. The bags themselves had no markings or distinctive features, and there were hundreds of manufacturers of such products. But even the detectives were soon surprised by the creativity they could display in such a complex challenge. They contacted N.L. Roberts, the man responsible for quality control at the company that produced the bags found in the suspect's apartment. At first, he identified the specific factory where the bags were produced, as there was a special code on the cardboard box containing the rolls, indicating that the product was made at a facility in Virginia. The expert then explained that a tiny amount of iron or titanium is included in the composition of the bags, depending on their color. Considering that the factory produces bags of various colors, the materials in the production are constantly changing, and the ratio of plastic to iron or titanium literally changes daily, since such tiny amounts cannot be measured with 100% accuracy, and there's no need to do that. In other words, experts could take bags from the suspect's apartment and the crime scene, measure the presence of the elements in the plastic using high-intensity X-rays, and get a very precise ratio. Through this analysis, they found that the ratio of iron and titanium to plastic in both bags was absolutely identical, indicating that they were manufactured on the same day and should belong to the same batch. But that's not all. During the production of trash bags, a small amount of microscopic debris ends up on the machines, which is acceptable within production standards. However, this results in small streaks visible to the naked eye when the plastic sheets later cut into bags are rolled out. These streaks are present on every bag in large amounts, forming a unique pattern for each roll of fabric. The debris particles on the conveyor belt are constantly moving, falling off and being replaced by new ones. So the pattern of similar streaks is preserved for a maximum of a few hundred feet of fabric. This means that it can be understood from this pattern that two different bags were not just made within the same batch, but within a few hours of each other. Experts compared the bags from the suspect's apartment and the crime scene, and the lines on them matched with astonishing precision. But that's not all. The experts also explained that after the bags are manufactured, they are rolled into a bundle using a machine, which often does this somewhat unevenly. However, if you don't look closely, these deviations are almost imperceptible and the rolls appear smooth. Examining the edges of the bags, however, reveals tiny folds and creases, forming a similarly unique pattern as with the streaks. In the end, the experts compared the bags again and found that the pattern on the bags from James's apartment matched the one from the crime scene. They concluded that the bag used by the killer was not just produced by the same company, but was manufactured within a range of almost 17 boxes apart. This meant that with a high degree of probability, the perpetrator took the bag from one of the rolls in James's apartment. Forensic analysts also compared the two types of fibers found on Jessica's clothing with the carpet in the suspect's apartment and the covers of his car seats. Both samples matched. Finally, a sound expert compared the 911 call recording with a voice sample from James and concluded that the voice belonged to the same person. Despite the incredible work done by the experts, detectives faced one major problem. All this fell into the realm of circumstantial evidence, but they were confident in James's involvement and decided to arrest him. The man was taken into custody, and the prosecution announced its intent to seek the death penalty. Considering that James continued to deny his guilt, the case proceeded to trial. The prosecution presented their version of how the crime happened. James spent a lot of time outside with his dog, and all the local kids knew him well. According to the police version, on that day, James noticed Jessica alone on a bench while walking his dog and started a conversation. He offered to take her to McDonald's, promising to buy her a hamburger, and Jessica agreed because she knew him well. After the restaurant, he presumably took her back to the apartment complex and invited her to his place. Perhaps he offered her to play with Pumpkin, his dog. His wife was at work, and the presence of carpet fibers from his living room on Jessica's clothes indicated that she was there on the day of her death. According to investigators, James might have attempted to assault Jessica, but something went wrong. Based on the forensic report, the perpetrator not only strangled the victim with his bare hands, but also pressed his palm against her face, perhaps because Jessica tried to scream, and he panicked and attacked her. After Jessica passed away, he placed her in a garbage bag to transport the body to his car without arousing suspicion from the neighbors. He drove a few miles and left the body near a water station, made the 911 call from a nearby gas station, and returned home. During the preliminary hearings, James's lawyers attempted to challenge all available evidence, arguing that there was no solid proof of their client's guilt. Despite the fact that the judge accepted the evidence, the defense was right. In cases involving the death penalty, the standards for evidence are much higher, and in James' case, there was a significant chance of avoiding this sentence. In light of these circumstances, a plea deal was proposed to the suspect. Under the terms of the deal, he would admit guilt to second-degree murder and receive a 40-year prison sentence without parole, thus avoiding the death penalty. In the summer of 1998, 2 years after the murder, James agreed to the deal. He wasn't required to disclose any details of the crime, but he mentioned that part of his decision was to spare Jessica's family and save them from going through the trial. The prosecution believed that the perpetrator genuinely showed remorse, citing his 911 call, the purpose of which remained unclear. The only logical explanation in this context was that James sincerely wanted to alleviate his guilt for such a heinous crime. Jessica's parents were not pleased with the deal, as they had hoped for the death penalty, and they also wanted the killer to confess. But James remained silent. Nevertheless, he didn't live to see the end of his term. James passed away in November 2011 at the age of 49 due to health problems, taking the details of his actions and motives with him to the grave. Jessica's case involved truly unique work by experts and detectives. The amount of information they gathered by examining ordinary garbage bags astonished even the judge, who had never encountered such evidence throughout his career.